let's discuss some of the social precursors to language. I think I've already been kind of alluding to the idea that you need to have interaction between the baby and a language speaker in order for the baby to actually learn the language. But why is that important? Why can't they just learn from baby Einstein or something like that? Well, there's a whole field of pragmatics that talks about how language is a social act. That the reason why humans evolved language is for very pragmatic reasons, right? It allows us to get our thoughts into the future and into other people's minds, and allows us to get our needs met and other kinds of things. Like language is fundamentally a social act. So the idea that you could teach a child a language by putting them in front of language tapes or something like that it doesn't make sense, because that's not the function of language, right? When we talk about child language, it makes it a lot more apparent that all of us, when we speak, use a whole host of different things to combine into what we call speech acts. Speech acts are not just the words that are coming out of your mouth, but they're also your facial expressions, your gestures, your use of the context in which you're speaking. You may be gesturing around the environment to show people what you're talking about. It's also the intonation that you use while you're talking. If you say something with an angry tone, it conveys a different message than if you say those exact same words, but in a laughing tone. I actually just had, literally today, a conversation via text where I said something completely just trying to make an example and being benign about it. I wasn't trying to say anything sarcastic, and the recipient thought that I had used that example on purpose to be snarky. And I'm like, what did I say that was snarky? I made an example. In the absence of facial expressions, context, intonation, gestures, a text message oftentimes can land wrong, right? Because it's not conveying the full message. And so speech acts really depend on all that stuff that includes us being near each other and seeing each other and hearing and seeing all the things that the speaker's hearing and seeing. And all that's really super important. And so we have to keep that in mind, that language is a social act. Now, when we talk about babies in particular, most of us adults and even older children will adopt what used to be called motherese when we're talking to babies. Today, we are more likely to call it parentese or child-directed speech. There was a brief period of time when the developmentalists wanted us to call it baby talk, but that has another meaning, and so that didn't ever catch on because people didn't like that. Because with motherese, we are not speaking in baby talk. We're not saying, oh, did you want your baby bottle? Are you cold? Come here, that mama hug you, like that. That is not motherese, parentese, or child-directed speech. What we're talking about here is a change in intonation. When you're talking to a baby, you tend to raise the pitch of your voice a little bit. It's also a change in what you're going to talk about. When you're talking to an adult, you could so easily say, well, next week when I get my vacation, I'm going to fly to Hawaii, and I really want to go see, the Polynesian Cultural Center. And you can talk about a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with what's going on right now. They're all, in a person's mind, and the use of the language is to get it into their mind, into the listener's mind. What I'm doing right now is a great example of it. But when you're talking to a baby, you can't do that. You have to talk about what's here and what's now and what is immediately going on. So like the example I gave before, when the adult is holding the ball and saying the word ball, the baby's holding the ball and the adult says ball. The ball is rolling on the floor and the adult says ball. Pretty soon the baby's going to start to figure out that the word ball is associated with that object, right? And that's what we do in Parentese. We talk about exactly what's right now. We use much simpler language. So we say things like, do you want to go to the park? And now, okay, the park's not here right now, but we're getting our jacket on and we're getting our shoes on and we're getting into our stroller. Do you want to go to the park? The park is fun, isn't it? Do you like the park? We're going to the park. Okay, here we are. This is the park. And it doesn't take long of these kinds of inane conversations, one-sided, that moms and dads have with their babies and caregivers have with the children in their charge, that they start to figure out what these words mean. And so it's really super important that we adopt this simpler language that is focused on the here and now, So I have another video that it was so successful in my last recording, I have become addicted to trying to run a video in my video. So here we go. We're going to run a video in my video. So this is on Mother Ease. I'm gonna mute myself and then run the video.
This is all about Parentese. Nobody on the planet takes a look at a baby and talks to them like a New York taxicab driver.
Hey, forget about it. Stop the crying over there.
Instead, if a baby is talked to like that, they'll move around and they're going. Parents, wise parents, talk to them in something we call Parentese. Parentese is characterized by 3 responses. Number 1, long vowel sounds.
Yes, you.
Short, clipped consonant sounds.
Baby, you're good baby.
And goose it way, way high. Now put them all together.
Yes, he's a good baby. Yes, oh, yes. Yamina, good host. Yes, she good host.
When you start sounding like somebody afflicted with undifferentiated schizophrenia, then you have true Parentese. Thank you very much.
So he, at the end, as he was demonstrating it, was doing a little bit of what I would consider to be more baby talk. But the premise is still valid, that you jack it up. So you say, do you want to go to the park? Do you like the park? Now, if I was speaking to you, I wouldn't say park with as much delay on the A sound. I'd be like, do you want to go to the park? Do you want to go to the park? There's the park, right? So you are trying to be repetitive. The reason for the higher pitch, by the way, is that babies are attracted to higher pitch sounds. And so it works for everybody. Older kids do it. They go, oh, does the baby want to get on the swing? Older kids know to do that. Dads do it. Moms do it. Child care providers do it. It's normal. Now, you simplify the language, but you don't have to speak the same jargon that the baby's speaking. We talked a little bit in the previous video about jargon. So if your baby calls their blanket, like my friend babysat, my daughter babysat for a friend, their 3-year-old, who called his blanket his leloli. Apparently it was yellow, and for some reason, I don't know, leloli was his jargon term for blanket. Now, of course, everybody in the family thought that was adorable, and so they were all calling it the leloli also. You don't need to do that if you don't think it's adorable. If you want your child to learn the real word for it, you just say, oh, you want your yellow blanket? Let me go see if I can find your yellow blanket. Like, you just always use the adult words for it. You can say it more slowly. You can say it more clearly. You can say it with a higher pitched tone in this motherese way, but you don't have to use exactly the jargon that they're using if you're trying to help them to learn the actual language words. So that's an important thing to include, that you don't have to speak the way that they're speaking, and you don't have to take the time to correct them. Oh, it's not called a leloli, it's called a yellow blanket. You don't have to do that. You use the correct words. So when they mistakenly say, Joey pushed me and I fell down, or I folded down, you don't have to say it's not folded, it's fell. You just say, oh, you fell down, and they ultimately figure it out. You don't have to deliberately attempt to shape them away from incorrect usage. That's what Skinner thought had to happen for a child to acquire language. Skinner thought the only way that you acquire language is through reinforcement and punishment for correct and incorrect language use, and then you ultimately would learn the correct words, and that you're motivated to speak because it gets you what you want. He was very much about reinforcement. Chomsky argued that kids have a natural instinct for learning language. They actually probably have a part of their brain that's designed for acquiring language. And so just through these natural give and take kinds of conversations that most children have with their caregivers, they will learn the language. And one of the ways I can really underscore that that's true is that you hear adult speakers of the English language using forms that are not correct, that they must have picked up through this kind of give and take with their environment, right? Like they were looking for the consistency in the language, and this is how the people around them used it. So a really common one from my childhood, people would say ain't, which is that's not a correct form of a word. But people pick it up because the people around them use it. And so what the child's job, according to Chomsky, is to look around in the world and figure out what the rules are to the language, and they have this innate language acquisition device, and then this very very sensitive grammatical center in the brain that is looking for the verbs, the objects, how to conjugate things, and it does it all on the fly without you even knowing that you did it. If you've ever learned a second language and you learned all these grammar rules for how to conjugate and all these things, you're like, we don't do this in English. And the teacher's like, yeah, you do. You just don't know it because that was your first language. If English was your second language, you might have had that thought about, why does English have all these rules when my language doesn't have it and your language does have it? We just don't even feel like we're having to do all this rule-based stuff when we pick it up as a child. And Chomsky's model does a really good job of explaining how that happens. Your textbook is I think I might have mentioned to you guys before, I minored in psycholinguistics when I was working on my PhD. Your textbook does a little bit of an incorrect representation of how Chomsky perceived the need for give and take with the environment for learning language. He absolutely acknowledged that while the tendency to learn language is innate, it is critical that you have interaction with the environment in order to activate those language centers and to cause you to actually learn the language that you're being exposed to. You can't learn it passively, and you can't learn it if you've gone too long in your childhood without having been spoken with. So there have been cases of children who were born deaf. The parents didn't recognize it. They didn't really teach them, get them into a program so they could learn sign language. And it's very difficult for them to learn a sign language after 8 years old. It's very difficult. And so you can end up with a child who can't produce language very well if you wait too long to introduce it. So it's really important that we're doing this in the first 2 years of life when it's very natural and very easy. So some cognitive precursors to language need to have object permanence, because why bother labeling these objects if they're just going to disappear? I may never see them again. So object permanence is a really critical first step in developing language. The second step is the development of concepts, starting to recognize that, for example, some people in the world live in my house with me, right? And I might call them mom and dad, or I might call them mom and mom, or whoever they are, right? Grandma and mom, or whoever it is. So there's concepts of people who live in my house and people who don't, right? There are people who are connected to me and people who are strangers. Like, you start to develop these big, broad concepts, animals versus humans, food versus animals. These big, broad concepts help you must be in place for the language learner to figure out how to apply labels, right? How to apply the language to these objects and these concepts. Imitation is a critical factor, because unless you realize that you could ultimately do what these other people are doing, that is speak, you won't start the behaviors that it takes to start imitating what they're doing, right? Like, you've got to see them as similar to you. You've got to see what they're doing as possible for you, so that then you can imitate what they're doing and ultimately be able to produce language. The use of symbols. Piaget, we talked about, thinks that babies are in the sensory motor period from birth to 2 years. The critical thing that transitions a baby from sensory motor into a child who is in the pre-operational phase is the development of symbolic thought. So the thing that will take us out of infancy and into childhood will be the baby's ability to recognize that I can apply symbols, that is words, to represent things in the real world or ideas in my head, right? So I can use these language symbols to substitute for something else. When they make that transition, they will have transitioned into the next stage of cognitive development. So we call infancy because it literally means know, and fancy means talk. So this is the stage when they aren't really talking yet. Once they can apply symbols in their use of language, they will have moved out of infancy by definition. Some really common early utterances tend in English. They tend to be objects first. So babies will have a lot of names for things in the U.S. Other cultures, like in Korea, their first words tend to be verbs. So it'll be things like, fall or talk will be the first utterances. So it really, but parents oftentimes are everybody's first labels, and the family pet. Holophrases, I've already been talking about. That's where you have maybe one word that you can utter, but you use the context in which you're uttering it, maybe make a gesture. So let's say that you want a cookie. You may point at the kitchen counter, open and close your hand, and say cook in a demanding tone. And you didn't say cookie, but anyone can figure out that what you want is the cookie, right? That's a hollow phrase where you're taking all of these things, these speech acts all together to convey some meaning. Usually early utterances are overextensions. So I mentioned that my grandson calls his dog Bayi. Well, you know what? He calls my dog Bayi too. He thinks all dogs are Bayi right now. He's, like I said, he's about 19 months now, and we're working on him starting to recognize that the generic word is dog. The specific word for this one is Bayi. This one is Dash. This one's Copper, right? Like we're trying to get him to start separating the three dogs out and stop calling them Bayi and calling them Dog, Bailey, Copper, Dash, right? But it's really common for children to overextend words. They have the one word, it kind of applies to, maybe I'll call, in fact, if we were to introduce him, let's say, to a cow, I wonder if he would call it a Bayi, right? Four-legged animal. It's not a Bayi. He can see it's not really Bailey, but it's a four-legged animal, so maybe he would call it a cow a Bailey. I don't know, right? I haven't tested him on that one. When they finally start putting words together, we call it telegraphic speech. And when they start putting words together, it's two at a time. So during telegraphic speech, you'll see them use a verb and a noun together. So they might say, Daddy, throw. Or they might say, throw, Daddy. One of them is a description. One might be a demand, right? But this telegraphic speech, again, is going to be a hollow phrase where they're going to take context, intonation, gesture, and put it together with the two words that they have and produce something that other people will be able to understand. Again, with the overextension, we call this overregularization. What they're going to do here is misconjugate words. I don't think I have a picture of it. No, I don't. So, for example, the example that I gave you earlier about falded. When you have an irregular verb like fall, to make a correct past tense of fall, you have to say fell. But when a child has about 1,000 words in their vocabulary, it becomes too complex to remember all the different variations of how that word can be conjugated. And so they start to show evidence that Chomsky's theory is probably correct. They start to apply a rule to all words, and they'll over-regularize words. So they realize that if I want to say something happened in the past, I put an ED on the end. And of course, they don't know what an ED is. I'm not implying that. They just know that you go duh at the end. So if I want to say that I fall in the past, I say falded, falled or falded. Or I want to say that I go to the store, but in the past, I say I goed or I wented. A lot of times they'll misconjugate the correct conjugation. It's quite interesting to watch them go through this over-regularization phase. So they do it with past tenses. They'll do it with plurals also, where they'll put an S on the end of a word that doesn't need to be pluralized with an S. Like they'll call sheep, sheeps. Oh, look at all those sheeps, right? So they'll over-regularize the pluralization rule. They'll also over-regularize what we call superlatives. So they'll say, this is my bestest friend, or I got the mostest. And you don't have to put an EST on the end of those superlatives, but you would on something like highest. Like that's the regular way to deal with a superlative. And so they misapply that, and we call that over-regularization. That over-regularization sticks with kids from about the time that they have about 1,000 words in their vocabulary through, like, I'll bet you sometimes still over-regularize words that you're not very familiar with, right? I mean, I know I do. So it's something that is kind of a sign that we're applying a rule in a situation when we can't remember what the special case is. And so that's some evidence that Chomsky's model is probably correct, that children spend that first 2 years of their lives figuring out the rules to the language and then applying them on the fly. So hopefully this all clarifies some of these details that are kind of a little bit tricky for understanding in cognitive development. And I will see you guys next in the social development of the child from 0 to 2 years of age.